All right. Hello, and welcome to FHIR Subscriptions. My name is Gino Canessa, and I will be your virtual host for this meeting. Before we get into it, there's a link here. It's also available in Whova, but this aka.ms/devdays-gino has this deck and actually has all the historical decks from this session as well for the past year and a half or so. So there are going to be a few links in here that you may want. So I would definitely recommend pulling from here instead of trying to note them down and type them all in yourselves.
Hey, Gino. I'm
Yes.
seeing the preview is currently disabled in the lower left-hand side.
The preview is current. Oh, apologies.
There you go. Perfect.
There we go. Yep, sorry about that. Window overlays as I was moving things. So here we go. Anyway, again, my name is Gino Canessa. I'm with Microsoft, and let's jump right in. So subscriptions are a pretty simple concept. Really, all it is saying, I'm a client, and I want to know when something changed. The server knows when something changes, and I would just like the server to tell me that the thing changed. Anyone with implementation experience should be properly frightened because, as we all know, simple concepts are generally pretty painful to implement. And so that's true, but we're kind of lucky. This was actually discovered back all the way in DSTU2 that this was going to be a model that people were interested in. And so it's been worked on for a long time here. I like to show this historical slide in particular because of two things. First is CDS hooks. So this kind of split off from subscriptions, and that's clinical decision support hooks. And so that's for UI events that are in workflow and a closed loop. So if you have a physician who is about to prescribe or order a procedure or prescribe a medication, and you want to give them decision support and saying, is it appropriate? Is it safe? All those types of things. You need to go off, do that workflow, and come back. So if that's the type of thing you want to be notified on, CDS hooks is what you're looking for. Lots of great content, presentations here at DevDays, and that's where you want to steer towards. The other one here is FHIRcast. And so this is a lot for session synchronization, and the focus is on real-time things. So if you have multiple applications running that the same person's using, again, you want to think about things like I have a dictation system and my EMR and my radiology viewer open. Oops. And I want to keep all of those in sync. If I change patients in one of them, I need that to show up in the other app. And that's what FHIRcast focuses on. So same thing, if you are trying to do that type of workflow, then FHIRcast is what you want. And again, there's lots of great documentation, and that's where you want to go. So during this time, when people figured out that these were very distinct workflows, there was kind of the core of subscriptions that was in R2 all the way through R4. And really what it is saying, as a client, here's a query to the server, and let me know whenever my result set changes. The reality is that sounds great, but there's a few issues. One is that it's really not implementable for servers at scale. Two is that you don't have any sort of discovery mechanism to say what is the server actually going to honor and what is it going to perform. So you ended up in this trial and error situation. And then there's some other just kind of quality of life things that, if something falls out of the set versus if something's deleted, you can't tell the difference, some of those pieces. And so actually back in April of 2019, FHIR Infrastructure said, no, the current mechanism isn't meeting all the use cases we need to cover, and let's start a redesign. So just like all of FHIR, for people that aren't as familiar, we wanted everything to be open, and we wanted to really focus on these use cases But we did, it's odd because we wanted to focus on the use cases, but we needed more input on them. So specifically engaging some of the different, cloud vendors versus EHR vendors versus individual implementers versus app developers, and really trying to pull from each of them to understand how subscriptions needs to fit into their workflows. So landed on a set of changes so far that's looking good for R5 publication. And I will note, I'll address the R5 thing here in a moment. And it's really kind of three sets of things. First is defining a subscription topic. So if people are familiar with PubSub or WebSub or any of those types of topic-based notifications, that's really the model that we wanted to move FHIR subscriptions into. That lets servers pick which ones they want. They're more portable, they're more implementable, lots of things like that. The second piece was actually on the subscriptions themselves. So there needed to be a few changes as far as more options in how much information gets transmitted back and forth, what types of channels are used, some of those things that are critical to wider adoption. And then the last piece are the actual notifications themselves that needed some updates and some quality of life improvements. Here's one of those link pages that I was warning you about. So since this is all primarily R5, you can see that everything's on build.phir.org. For further reading, I'll say this first link here, the subscriptions framework page. If that's the only link you follow from this whole thing, I would say that would definitely be the one to do. And that just has a conceptual overview and a lot more. It goes into the details and links out to all of the different pieces and how they work together. I will note also, if you're using these, please review them, test them, comment. There's a subscription stream on Zulip. We have regular FHIR infrastructure calls, Jira, everything goes through there. And then connectathons, and I'll plug there's plans for a connectathon in January that will focus on some key pieces here. As I mentioned before, we are targeting FHIR R5, but as many people know, R5 is a little ways off. So we've also started a Backport implementation guide. So this link, it's again sponsored through FHIR infrastructure, and it's really taking the R5 models and design and kind of filling it in R4 so that you can use it in existing implementations. There are some limitations, and we'll get into that in a little bit. For the purposes of the discussion here, I'm generally going to prefer discussing things in the R5 models and names, just because we got to assign things. So instead of subscription status in R5, we have to use parameters in R4. So I'll highlight those differences, but I'm going to primarily discuss things in the context of R5 because they're named better. I'll note there's a reference implementation that we'll get again to more into later, but this does support both the R5 and the R4 Backport. The R4 version is exactly current with what's on build.phir.org. The R5 version is based on connectathons, so that the models get updated. So it's actually from the September connectathon, and then in December we'll switch over to the January one. So with all that groundwork out of the way, what is a subscription topic? So it's a definitional resource, and it really has a couple of key pieces. The first is defining your data and change of interest. So kind of the canonical example I'm going to be using is patient admission or the start of a new encounter. So in this case, we're saying we're interested in encounters when they go into the in progress state. And so a topic that's covering that, that's what it needs to say. It also needs to define the filters that are allowed. So again, in a very basic implementation of admissions, we know that we're going to need to, for instance, filter on patient ID, right? You say patient has their app and they need to get notified when they have new encounters or things like that. There's additional groups and different things like that, but again, the topic is going to say what you're allowed to filter on. Critical here is that it's a well-defined concept. And so this is, again, we want topics to be broadly adopted, and we want to make sure that servers and clients both have the same understanding of what's being done. So in this case, the start of an encounter and admission, you want to have documentation showing what that is and make sure that anyone using the topic on either side has the same idea of what that topic actually means. So to that end, there's a few things. You can base them on operations. You know, when a new patient is created, you can do computable definitions via FHIR path or query states. And then you can do external or internal definitions so that you don't have to go and invent every single topic you want to support. So again, I know I just belabored this, but to say it again, the most critical part in defining a topic is defining the concept. So you want readable descriptions, you want computable definitions, whatever is going to let people make sure that that topic is what they're looking for. We definitely recommend some sort of formal documentation, whether it's a full-blown implementation guide or not, isn't required. So we actually link to a lightweight example here, and this is from defining that encounter start that I'm just talking about. And it's just some markdown documents on GitHub, but it lets people really understand how to use a topic. And the goal of this is for broad adoption. We want to say that instead of everyone trying to define their own admissions topic and then trying to figure out as a client which one this particular server supports and going through a very involved discovery process, we want to make sure that you can just pick a canonical URL and then find everything else from there. To that end, there's a way to derive. So the subscription topic has a derived from that links to another URL, and that's in the search parameters for subscription topic. That's all covered that it can be found. And this is because you might need to make some changes, but still keep the spirit of the topic. This first example here is saying, if you need to make FHIR path, the definition of the FHIR path different for your server, because you're using slightly different than the way that the initial definition did, great, make a new topic, derive from it, and then when people search for that initial topic, they'll still find your implementation. Same thing for this next point, exposing additional filters. Going back to admissions, you might say in your workflow, it's very common to filter by the patient's age. You want to know when, patients that are minors are checked in, or patients that are seniors are checked in, or different things like that, and have different subscriptions on that. So again, derive from that original topic. People can find it, people can use it, and use the additional filters you added. There are a couple of things we just said you shouldn't do. So again, this is just dealing with expectations of clients and servers, that if you try to remove an existing filter, you can't derive from that. The client won't be able to understand what's going on. And same thing with changing the base resource. You can't say, the start of an encounter is like the start of a new medication or treatment. And so I'm going to just swap out the resource. Again, clients have no way of discovering that in any sort of reasonable manner. So this is just a sequence diagram. I tend to like these. And so I start off with this relatively straightforward one. And we have two actors here, the server and the client. And then there's just a note saying that the server needs to pre-implement whatever topics it's interested in. The client can get that list. The server will respond with the list of the search set bundle of what it has. And then the clients can pick which one it wants to use. So time is going as we move down, and then each actor has its own line. So once you have a topic, you need to actually make a subscription. The subscription itself then is just a request for notifications on a topic. Pretty straightforward. It leans down what subscription actually has. It does have whatever filters are desired. So again, if you're saying I'm interested in admissions, you might say I'm interested in all admissions because I'm part of the internal workflow. Or you might say I'm interested in admissions for this patient ID because that's me and I want to know when, I want my software to be notified when that happens. The other part is kind of the what and the how. So the what is the payload configuration and the how is the channel information. Again, the channels are just methods of communication. So there's two parts. First are the predefined ones that we've added to the standard and clearly defined, but then we also did leave it extensible. So for instance, here we have the 4 that are predefined: REST hook, WebSocket, email, and messaging. And those cover, REST hooks are just an HTTP post. WebSockets are becoming more popular as you have web-based clients that need to come into the server because they can't stand up their own URL endpoint. Email is actually getting more popular during COVID times for the public health scenario, saying, I don't have a consistent server or FHIR server or even a client that's generally monitoring things. I just need to send an email to my public health authority whenever this type of event happens. And then the last one that we predefined was FHIR messaging. And that's for if you're in a workflow that's already using FHIR messaging, then it makes sense to add subscriptions as a feature to that workflow instead of starting from scratch and doing a different type. But again, the reason we left this extensible is maybe in your workflow you want to use message queuing, or you have a specific protocol that you've done and optimized for devices that you're doing. All those things, you can define a channel type, and that way it'll still operate in the same framework without breaking anything there. So after we have the how, we come back to the what. And we know that there's a notification, but what's actually in it? And so to that end, we defined 3 levels of information that you might want to include. So here we start off with empty payloads. And again, this is the least information. So there's minimal PII, PHI, almost none. And the only reason I'll say, we'll get back to that in security, but essentially you're just saying something happened on this subscription. So the client needs to query the server, figure out what happened, and then process. The next level up includes the ID of the resources that are interesting. So again, going back to our admission, you might have the ID of the encounter, you might have the ID of the patient that's relevant, some of those types of things. But you're just sending that. So you don't, again, have PI, PHI, you just have IDs that are going back and forth. And then we have the full resource version, which is saying, in the notification itself, send the encounter, send the patient, send whatever needs to be there so that I can take action without coming back to the server. So in a little more detail is here. And again, there's the sequence diagrams. And I know the text is a little small, but really it's just to highlight this is the same workflow happening in each of the modes. So we can see in the first scenario over here, we have the server and the client next to each other. And the server says, okay, I'm going to send a notification to the client, and it doesn't really have anything. It just says something happened. So the client next step is to say, okay, well, I need to do a search on the server, figure out, hash that against what I have locally already, and then go ahead and retrieve those pieces that I need. So those queries in particular can be pretty expensive for servers, but there's very little information being sent to the client. So, you know, it's again a balance between kind of privacy and security versus convenience and performance. So if you want to grab the middle of the road, that's the ID only one here. You can see here now the server is sending the same notification, but it actually has a full URL here. And again, these are obviously fake, but just to highlight what it's doing, it's saying, hey, there's an encounter, patient 123, encounter 10. So in this case, the client can skip issuing that expensive query to the server and just directly do a GET. This is nice because the client doesn't have the resource until they've re-authed to the server and actually retrieved the encounter in this case. So it does simplify a lot of the security concerns, but still give that balance that you're not constantly issuing queries to the server. And then the last one here is the full resource, and we can see this is simplifies the workflow even more because the server actually includes the resource in the bundle. And so it can send the notification to the client, and the client can do its processing without ever going back to the server. And again, if you're going to be doing this, you want to make sure that you've done all of your security evaluations and made sure that there's no problems in sending those things through. But this gives a pretty wide range of what can be done and what can be sent and in an agreed upon manner. So I've kind of glossed over this so far, but what is in a notification? So, and this is where things start to diverge between the R4 and the R5 versions a little more. In R5, we have a nice new bundle type called subscription notification. And that has our nice subscription status resource to give all the meta information, the link back to the subscription, the link to the topic, information about how many events, error detection, all those kinds of things. In the R4 backport, these don't exist. So instead, we're using a history bundle and we're using parameters instead of subscription status. And we'll see an example of that later. And then obviously the bundle has whatever payload has been agreed on. And so that's controlled by subscription content. And it can be not present, it could be URLs, it could be URLs and resources. That's just dependent on the actual subscription. So this is a kind of a full walkthrough of the REST hook style. And so you can see now we have not just the server and the client, but we do have an additional actor for the client endpoint. And I wanted to call this out because REST hooks are the most common style, but you do have to stand up a web host at a place where the server has access to. And so you can see this happens in sequence after our topic discovery has already happened. And so our client can just say, okay, create a subscription. And the server goes ahead and says, sure, I will create that subscription and set it to requested and give you your response. And then the server is actually going to go through and validate that endpoint. So in this case, it's going and trying to contact the client endpoint, posting a handshake bundle. So again, there's descriptions on what all these things are in the documentation. But essentially, it just does a check to see, is this accessible? Will it respond? Yes. And then everything is set to active and subscription notifications can start going. In a perfect world, that would be it. You just receive your notifications. But we're also aware that errors happen. They could be on the server, they could be on the client, they could be in between. The internet is mostly reliable, but not actually reliable. Trying to build a system that has guaranteed reliable delivery, all these things, is well beyond the scope of the specification and not something we can say is the minimum bar for using this. So we wanted to make sure that we had mechanisms in place to allow clients to figure out when there's an error state and then what they should do from there. So I'm just going to touch briefly on this for the two, just because there's one key point in particular I want to highlight. So the first is that in that status information, we have this events and subscription start field. And that's just a counter saying how many events have happened on this notification. So in this case, our subscription saw that we had 20, 21, and 23. After waiting for a few seconds to see if it was in transit or anything like that, the client says, no, 22 is missing, and I'm going to start my recovery process. Now, what that recovery process actually is will vary on clients. It's just an important thing to make sure as you're designing the client that you keep in mind, saying whether it's querying the server and getting a full list of, in this case, encounters, for instance, and then doing that hashing again. Whatever that looks like, that's going to be very specific to the client, but you do want to make sure you have that process in mind as you use this framework. And then the last step of that process is actually to go and reset the subscription back to active. So once you've recovered and you know that you're in a good state, you want to go back and reset the subscription so you continue getting notifications. Same thing on this side. One of the things that was added is this heartbeat notification. And so you could say on your subscription, depending on, again, what the workflow looks like, you might say a minute, an hour, a day, however often you're expecting to get things. If that interval of time elapses without getting something, then you can say, okay, well, the client knows communication's broken, maybe my SSL certificate has expired, whatever the case may be, the client has a way of discovering that and then going and again, going through its recovery process. So that same spiel that I just went through, you need to make sure that your client can recover because these types of situations will happen in production. Just a quick note here on current discussions. Obviously, we're doing channel testing. The REST hooks is pretty well explored, but some of these other channels, email, WebSockets, and FHIR messaging, we could use a little more feedback. So if those are in your use cases, now is the time to get your voice heard and make sure that all of your needs are met. Security is front and center because this is an ongoing discussion that I don't expect will stop with R5 or R anything. And so there's a constant feedback loop of what we can update, what we can add to make sure that people are doing the things that they should do. And then the only feature I'll call out that we haven't added that we know we want to is a way of defining graphs of resources. So if you want to say, yes, I want encounters, but I want to make sure I have the patient, the encounter, and any observations from that encounter. There's no way, we don't have any definitional way of doing that. And it's just that we wanted to make sure that all the core functions worked before we started trying to get consensus on what these graphs would look like. So that is planned. And again, if that's super interesting, please get involved and discuss, and we're happy to have more feedback. Jumping in specifically to the implementation guide, or the Backport implementation guide, there's a few things to keep in mind. First is subscription topics don't technically exist. We've played with wrapping these in BASIC or doing different things like that. But at the end of the day, all we really needed was the canonical URL because that's what's keying the concept. And so if you're going back and using this Backport, so far the use cases have said, that's fine. We can just use the URL and we don't need to actually see the canonical topics. So it does have this additional restriction that you can't create a topic that you want to subscribe to. But in part, that's not really needed because the R4 style of subscriptions allows for that. So if that's your use case, then you don't need to port everything to R5 version yet. You can just use the existing R4 functionality. The changes on subscription are really just a set of extensions. And we have pretty much all of the fields from R5 ported over as extensions onto the R4 subscription. There's a special note here to be careful with subscription criteria. And that just has to do with if you're doing multiple resources and how that interaction happens. And in particular, If a server is non-conformant to the implementation guide, but has subscriptions in R4, you can end up in some weird situations that, again, I'm happy to discuss at a future time for that, but it's a little long for this presentation. Similarly, for the notification bundle, and I mentioned this earlier, we don't have the new bundle type and we don't have subscription status as a resource. So we need to use a history bundle and parameters instead, and there's some limitations that are inherent to that, but it does get all of the required functionality across. And then just to renote, yes, you want to verify that people are actually conformant with the Backport IG, because having subscription support in R4, the resource will look similar enough that you can end up in getting notifications in the wrong times or not getting ones you're expecting. And this is all online. Right now it's on build.fhir.org, and it's planned for ballots, the first ballot in January. So right now we're just finishing up, tidying up everything and moving things around. So you may see daily changes over the next week or two until the ballot freeze happens. So if you want to build any of these things, you kind of need something to test against. And so there's, again, some links here. There's a page, overview page that has, we have a reference implementation that includes both a client and a server. And so there's a lot of pieces to it. I do want to just switch over briefly here and show this is the page that's linked there, subscriptions.argo.run. And I just want to highlight this quickly for two reasons. One, so that people can see how to use it, and two, so that we actually see some examples of some of these resources. And instead of me putting them in slides, we can have them come through live as we're doing it. When you come up, you come to the config page. There's a bunch of links here. Again, mostly the same links that are in the deck we just went through. Different connectathon tracks, the about this software, the specifications, things like that. The actual configuration here, again, I want to highlight this option, which is to use the backport to R4, and I need to update this text because it is not an Argonaut backport IG now, it is the FHIR backport IG. And then, you know, the mode on the UI and things like that. There's these options up here are for actually connecting to the server. And so I definitely want to, this is where you'll want to play if you're doing your own implementation of a server. I'll note that all of the software is running in the web browser. So even if I need to point this at a local server running on localhost or loopback, that works, even though the UI is public external. And you can add your auth header here. And then this client host, generally you want to leave alone. If you're online, this one will work. This is just what stands up the actual HTTP endpoints and then forwards those subscriptions back to this web UI. If you're trying to run disconnected from the internet, then you'll want to pull the GitHub repo and run it locally so that you have a URL you can do that. So in our case, we're just going to go ahead and connect. And up here on the top are kind of these first two are kind of the guided walkthroughs that we go through in Connectathons. Those are the scenarios. And then there's the playground, and I'll get to the DevDays one at the end. So you can see here we're using the backport. And so we can actually see the request that went to the server. And we were asking for the topic list. And it returned a set of parameters. And it had the topic canonical. And it had this encounter IG as the URL. That's the only one this server supports right now. So it's a short list, but you can see the client has to understand what that topic means. It doesn't have the computable definitions and all these extra pieces that you have in the R5 mode. But again, if you're implementing a backport IG like this, we have figured out that you probably know which topics you're interested in. In this case, since we're doing a patient-based encounter notification, we can grab a patient. So we want test McTestface is always a good one. And same thing, we can see the request URL that it sent, the response data, and then some nice info. It went and automatically created a new endpoint for us. so that we have a place that we can actually send notifications to. So we can see we'll use this URL here when we create a subscription. And we can do that here. So the request URL, you can see we were just using the normal R4 subscription endpoint, but the subscription we gave it, we have a lot of extensions. So we have, for instance, here in Payload, there's an extension that's saying we want ID only. That's something that was added in the R5 version. On the channel itself, we have extensions for the heartbeats, for where we want to put URLs, the max number of counts of entries in a bundle, some of these other things. And then same thing with the subscription itself, we have an extension pointing to that topic. We can see here the server did send a handshake. So again, we're in R4, so we have a history bundle. And we can see this parameter resource is the first thing. And so this is telling us which subscription this was for, the topic it was for. We can see there's been 0 events in the subscription and 0 events in this bundle. It was in a requested state, and it was a handshake. So that all meshes with what we would expect to see in R4. And if we went and posted an encounter, and it's a very simple encounter here, you can see we're just doing a new encounter that's virtual and in progress. We can see that it actually sent us a notification. So to that URL endpoint, it posted a bundle. Again, it's a history bundle, but we can see this one is an event notification. And it has 1 event in the subscription, 1 event in this notification. So you can see, you can go through a lot of these things. The playground has a lot more functionality as far as saying if you want to connect via WebSockets or test email, things like that. Those are all here in the playground. And again, if there's anything, please just let me know. And if it's something you need for testing. The last one is this DevDays tab. And this is actually from when we were in person and we had the 40-minute tutorial sessions. And I do keep these updated as well. But it's kind of the most basic projects that you could interact with the subscription with. And so that's using Node via proxying or tunneling, and then C# using Kestrel. So again, it's just kind of a quick walkthrough to say, here's the most basic project that you can do. So with that, we have a few minutes left for questions, and I'm gonna try and manage this. I don't know if we have another moderator back, so please feel free to unmute and talk. And otherwise, we'll go through the text and the chat as well.
Hey, Gino, you do have 3 questions that are posted up in Hoover. Do you mind if I read them off to you?
Not at all.
So let me start with the first one.
Yeah.
This is from Dunmail, and the question is, the client can respond to a subscription by retrieving data from the server. Does the proposal include capability to share credentials to access the resource, or is this entirely at the discretion of the implementer?
Yeah, so good question. So far, all of the feedback has been specifically not to include credentials in the notifications, and that's because the server needs to make sure that the client is actually authorized to go back and do it. There's some workflows where it's been said, yes, it would be great if I could include, a link that'll work to fetch this regardless of who has it. The problem with that is the potential for leaking patient information goes up through the roof. So, so far, it has been brought up a couple times, but so far it's been decided that no server is going to be willing to implement it. So you need to leave that as an external thing.
Okay, let me follow up with the next question. What is the recommended way to send information from several resources within a notification? Would it be to create a document bundle, one which is only needed for the notification?
So this is jumping into when I mentioned earlier about graphs of resources, and so far we haven't gotten consensus on a definition on how you should define this. The notification bundle itself, you can actually just include the additional resources. So if you want to send to use our patient admission, yes, the key resource is Encounter, but there's no reason why you can't insert a patient in that same bundle directly. It can get messy if you're trying to batch things because it's not really set up for all of that. So I would say to beware of that if you're implementing on the server. But yeah, you could also create a document bundle. You can, any of those things are valid. And then we're hoping to start having discussions as all the R5 models and then the Backport models and all that documentation is done. That's kind of one of the next major topics that we have for discussion is how can we get an agreed format for what these graphs should look like.
Yeah, Valentinas has two additional questions. Does R5 subscriptions support sending notifications for a resource being deleted? What about Backport to R4?
Yes, both of them do. So the definition of the topic can be on an operation. So you can say things like, I want to know when a patient was deleted. Again, those are generally going to be for internal workflow reasons because that's externally could be an issue. There are some caveats and we do discuss them, I believe on the subscriptions overview page, or if not, one of those pages. And I do have a larger blog post about it that you can get into some odd corner cases as far as saying, obviously you can't send a URL of a resource that's been deleted. That doesn't particularly help, particularly because you don't necessarily want anyone to access that resource. If it was entered in error or things like that, you want to make sure that anyone accessing it knows exactly why they're doing it. So there's a lot of guidance there, but again, we don't go too far in some of those details just because that will be implementation specific.
Okay, and one last question from Valentinas. Does R5 subscriptions support sending notifications for a resource being deleted? What about, did I just ask you that one?
Yep, it's scrolled, yep.
Okay, yeah, so those are the 4 questions. Are there any others?
I had one more question about the subscriptions being used to replicate one FHIR server into another, and whether that's still a possible scenario with R5.
Yeah, in R5, that's I'll say definitionally, that's allowed. Whether a server will support it would be interesting to see. But in the subscription topic, you could say, I want, don't specify a resource, so any resource, and I want all operations. I want create, delete, update. I want everything for every resource. And if the server says that topic's there, then you essentially have a change feed from that server. Which ones will actually implement it? I can see a pure FHIR server implementing it. So if you talk about Happy or Azure or Graham's FHIR server, I can see that being something that they would be interested in. When you talk about Facade servers that are laying on top of a different format of data store, that might be more challenging just from the point of view of saying they don't necessarily have discrete events firing based on changes to FHIR resources because they're changing the underlying data models instead. But again, there's nothing that would prevent it. It's just looking at what would likely be implemented.
Let's see if there's any more. I think that could be it. Nice job. Thanks everyone for joining, and the recording will be up there in a bit. If you have any additional questions, you can always post them up on Huba.
All right. Thanks much. Appreciate it, and have a great day, everyone.
Thanks, Gino.
Thanks.